Welcome to News from World.
Russia's aggressive policies in Eastern Europe and the war in Ukraine received harsh and great reactions from all countries of the world. The United Kingdom was one of the countries that exhibited the most solid and effective stance against leader Vladimir Putin's policies of occupation of Ukraine. The UK's bold moves were driving the Russian authorities crazy because the United Kingdom had integrated many powerful weapon systems into the Ukrainian army that changed the fate of the war in Ukraine. The United Kingdom was the first to introduce Western main battle tanks to Ukraine's armed forces and has trained more than 60,000 Ukrainian soldiers. In early May, the British government made a huge impact on the battlefield when it sent long-range Storm Shadow cruise missiles to Ukraine. These missiles had the longest hit range of any weapon ever supplied to Kiev. Initially, the Russian government underestimated the Storm Shadow missiles. However, the Ukrainian forces launched an all-out counterattack against the Russian army with the power of Storm Shadow. According to officials, Storm Shadow missiles were now on the scene, with the potential to hit the Kerch Strait Bridge, Russia's only link with annexed Crimea, which Ukraine hopes to recapture in a counterattack. The Ukrainian military said that the Storm Shadow missiles used so far hit all Russian targets. Russian-controlled ports, airports, military bases, and arsenals were blown up in critical areas such as Berdyansk, Mariupol, and Melitopol. Even Russian ships in the port of Berdyansk were damaged. After all this, tensions between Russia and the United Kingdom began to increase significantly. While the Russian army was severely defeated at the front, the Kremlin hardened its attitude towards London. Former Russian President Dmitri Medvedev has said UK officials are now legitimate military targets for Moscow, in response to the UK foreign minister's remarks that Ukraine has the right to strike military targets on Russian soil. Medvedev, deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, stated that by providing military aid to Ukraine, the UK was de facto leading an undeclared war against Russia, describing the country as Moscow's eternal enemy. The harsh warning of President Vladimir Putin's close ally and deputy in the country's Security Council shocked the world agenda. Countries of the world, NATO alliance members, EU, and other international alliance groups claimed that Dmitri Medvedev's attitude was nothing but madness. Crazy Medvedev's rhetoric surprised even Putin. Despite Vladimir Putin, Medvedev seemed to be trying to make statements and decisions like the head of state. This was perceived as a sign of imbalance in the balance of power in the Kremlin. Actually, Medvedev may be going through a minor shock because the Kremlin and Medvedev had witnessed the power of the UK. Medvedev, who made much harsher rhetoric than Russian leader Vladimir Putin, was also negatively affecting the New World Order, with steps aimed at escalating the Ukraine war. Medvedev's words seemed to pose a direct threat to the UK government or military officials, who were thought to be helping Kiev in the war started by Putin. According to Medvedev, legitimate military targets beyond the Ukrainian border are part of Russia's self-defense. In response to the sounds of swords from Moscow, a critical sharing on this issue from the official channels of the United Kingdom drew attention. Speaking during a visit to Estonia, a NATO country bordering Russia, where royal troops are stationed, British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly argued that Kiev has a legitimate right to defend itself. He also clarified that James Cleverly's mainland of Russia is a legitimate target for Ukrainian drones. This striking statement was described as an open duel against Medvedev and Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Mr. Cleverly also made critical assessments about Dmitri Medvedev's opposition to military aid to the Ukrainian army. The UK Foreign Secretary stated that Russia has the right to send military aid beyond the UK's borders to undermine its ability to transmit power to Ukraine. After Ukraine was blamed for drone strikes on Moscow and the elite suburbs where Putin and other senior officials lived, Cleverly was taking tougher and more effective steps than Washington in supporting attacks inside Russia. In fact, the US administration was taking a firm and clear stance towards Russia, just like the United Kingdom. As the end of the war in Ukraine loomed ahead, the Biden administration was increasing its support for Kiev and providing additional billions of dollars in financial aid alongside more advanced weapons systems. During his recent visit to Ukraine, President Joe Biden reaffirmed America's unwavering commitment to Ukraine's democracy, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Meanwhile, the Washington defense establishment has largely ignored Russia as a long-term threat to U.S. and NATO security. According to them, Russia not only lost the war in Ukraine, but was so crushed by Ukraine's resistance that it will not pose a threat to NATO in the coming years. The poor performance of the Russian military in the early stages of the war in Ukraine astonished almost the entire U.S. defense community, just as the Russian Air Force was unable to gain air superiority. The war also revealed problems with logistics, command and control, intelligence, and naval operations of the Russian army. Ukraine's successful resistance is seen in the West not only as an end in itself, but also as a means of advancing the strategic goal of weakening Russia's military too much to pose a future threat to NATO. Now, many in the Washington defense community, especially in the Pentagon, consider this strategy a success. The current attitude towards the Russian military may be, in part, a reaction to the earlier exaggeration of Russian capability. General Mark Milley, Chief of Staff of the United States, had predicted at the beginning of the Russian invasion that Kiev would fall within 72 hours. Now the pendulum swung to the other side. Many military and political officials no longer care about the current capabilities of the Russian military or the future threat Moscow may pose to its neighbors. Also, according to General Milley, Russia lost and they collapsed strategically, operationally, and tactically. As a result, Moscow pays a huge price on the battlefield. But is General Milley justified in his assessment? As in previous wars, the Russian military today has learned a remarkable lesson from its initial failures. In response to fierce Ukrainian resistance, supported by the support of the West, the Russian army reverted to Soviet-era tactics and techniques. Specifically, this meant relying on mass and brute strength to outsmart an opponent. But Moscow lacks the financial resources, population, and industrial base to make up for its current losses, rebuild its military, and surpass Ukraine, even if Ukraine continues to receive Western support. The Russian military quickly adopted the use of drones for both reconnaissance and attack, and developed tactics and techniques against Ukrainian drones. The Russians have changed the way that they use fixed-winged aircraft and helicopters to account for Ukrainian air defense. In addition, Putin's army has also improved its counter-battery capabilities. But all this did not prevent the Russian army from being rooted on Ukrainian soil and the failure of Moscow's invasion operation. On the other hand, the claim that the Russian invasion has diminished as an acute military threat to NATO will likely play a role in current debates about both the size and composition of future U.S. defense budgets. If the threat posed by Russia was significantly reduced, wouldn't it make sense to reduce funding for army modernization, especially on capabilities such as tanks, armored combat vehicles, field artillery, and aircraft? If NATO is secure and the Chinese threat requires an increase in the Navy, long-range platforms for the Air Force, and expanded air and missile defense, can the Army be scaled down? Any attempt to make the U.S. Army force structure a power that pays for additional capabilities to fight China must be resisted. Efforts to restrict upgrades on existing platforms such as the M1 Abrams main battle tank, Stryker, Paladin self-propelled howitzer, and Apache attack helicopter are equally valid. An additional lesson to be learned from the Ukrainian conflict is the critical need for army modernization, including both long-range attack and armed reconnaissance aircraft, long-range precision fire, expanded air and missile defense, more drones and air-launched effects, and effective countering. In summary, we mentioned that Kiev allies such as the UK and the USA never bow to threats like Russia and China, and protect the world order against all kinds of dangers. Thank you for watching us.